This week, one foreign policy story dominates the global headlines. Surprise, it's Venezuela. So, if we here at War Fronts are coming to you to discuss anything else, well, you'd best believe that it is really kind of urgent, because we see the views that Venezuela got, so here we are giving you a video about Iran. You'll want to watch it. Because right now, the nation of Iran is on the brink of collapse. It is facing a crisis worse than the Mahsa Amini riots, worse than the decades-long crush of international sanctions, and even worse than last year's 12-day war against Israel. Cities are slipping out of Tehran's control, the Ayatollah is reportedly preparing to make a quick exit, and it's an open question whether Iran's economy or its water supply is going to collapse first. Israel is back on the path toward all-out war, and just days after Washington's actions in Venezuela, it appears that Uncle Sam already has his sights set on a new target. From reading this is a crazy year. From reading the news this morning, I'm like, well, it's Greenland, right? Oh, we're going to be busy. 47 years after the Islamic Revolution, it appears that Iran may not last a month. So, here's everything you need to know about Iran's current crisis and what it can tell us about a coming storm that could arrive in mere days. Wrong place, wrong time. At the very start of this episode, we would be wise to acknowledge a consistent theme in our geopolitics over the last several decades. Predictions that the Islamic Republic of Iran could fall are very common. Instances where the Islamic Republic has actually collapsed are precisely zero. So, to understand why this time could be different, we've got to give a bit of background, starting with the awful 2025 that set the stage for a crisis in 2026. Over the course of the past year, Iran has been on the receiving end of immense Israeli and American firepower across June's 12-day war, and although Iran's Ayatollahs could claim a measure of victory in the conflict simply because their regime was not obliterated, the war still left Iran's defense apparatus crippled. Iran's air defenses, its missile stockpiles and production lines, and its nuclear program were all severely compromised during the war, each sustaining damage that will take years to fix. Then, Iran was hit by a water crisis that's only gotten worse, as the rainfall that Iran desperately needs just has not arrived. Finally, Iran has been forced to watch as a large share of its international network of proxy organizations has been dismantled. Hamas and Hezbollah in particular have endured severe setbacks over the course of the year. Meanwhile, on the home front, public morale has been dropping as hardliners lose their faith in their regime, and people who oppose the Ayatollahs lose any real reason to fear them. So when Iran was hit with an economic crisis during the final days of 2025, it was in a very weak position to respond, especially when its new financial troubles turned out to be rather severe. The most urgent problem was a rapid devaluation of the Iranian rial, a currency that hasn't done well for quite a while, but one that hit incredible lows over the last several weeks. As of now, the rial is trading at 1.4 million to 1 against the US dollar. That's congratulations, you're a millionaire in Iran. Probably a billionaire. That's a rapid devaluation of roughly 80% compared to just a year ago. Even with the official numbers, inflation in Iran spiked to around 42% annually, and inflation for food prices has been even worse, greater than 70%. As food and other basic goods have become unaffordable, Iran's leaders have decided that it was just the right time to raise prices on the country's subsidized gasoline as well. Great move. So, with the Iranian public already squeezed from so many angles at once, it probably shouldn't have come as much of a shock when people reacted negatively to the news that a rial was now roughly as valuable as a clump of pocket lint. At first, people only took to the streets in relatively small numbers, most of the merchants in the capital city of Tehran. But unlike past instances of public protest in Iran, where the regime's response to dissent is typically both harsh and immediate, Tehran's street sellers didn't face immediate reprisals. The next day, they were back in the streets, and their numbers had grown. The day after that, the crowds grew again. Similar acts of defiance started to pop up in other Iranian cities, and then even in the rural countryside where historically crackdowns tend to be at their most severe. Within a week, the protests have become a nationwide phenomenon, and at the time of writing, they are everywhere. The Conflict Tracking Critical Threats Project noted in a daily update on Monday that from the start of protests on December the 28th, Iran has seen over 350 protests across 28 of the country's 31 provinces. Already it's clear that these protests are different than the mass uprisings of 2022 and 2023 following the death of Mahsa Amini in the custody of Iran's morality police. Back then, protests were a divisive issue in Iran. They were about religion, social conservatism, and belief, or lack thereof, in the values of the Iranian regime. Now, though, the cause of the protests is far more unifying. Acute, spiraling economic concerns made worse by corruption and mismanagement, with an equal potential to destroy the lives of all people regardless of what they believe. That doesn't just mean that civilians are feeling the pain either. So are soldiers, internal security forces, and local religious leaders that support the regime. All the burning rage from Iran's political opposition is still out there, bottled up after the Mahsa Amini protests failed, and tempered by the lessons learned during that very difficult time. And they've had reason to be encouraged, as Iran's regime has started to direct its morality police to let more and more things go, something that all citizens know the Ayatollahs would never allow if they were still as powerful as they used to be. By the first few days of January, the protests have begun to devolve into intermittent riots, running clashes with police and vandalism and attacks against state institutions. Worse yet, people were starting to die, with the first 2 fatalities confirmed by state media on the 1st of January after security forces had opened fire in some areas. The regime started to take a much heavier hand toward the protests, and although it did its best to make a show of differentiating between peaceful protests and riots, Iran's supreme leader openly instructed security forces that, quote, rioters should be put back in their place, end quote. The nation's judiciary chief called for, quote, no mercy, end quote, against the rioters, and the actions of Iran's security forces have changed to match. As of Tuesday, the 6th of January, the death toll stood at 35 or more, according to international activists, with over 1,200 people detained, at least 1 hospital raided, and regime forces now alleging that, quote, organized cells are working to exploit the unrest. But despite the fact that attempts to appease the protesters have clearly ended, the regime seems to be in a state of panic. Leaked directives from Iran's central bank called for all Iranian banks and financial institutions to prepare for mass shutdowns, infrastructure collapse, and regime-wide chaos, while even despite its financial troubles, the regime attempted to announce a monthly cash payment system for citizens. In a stunning statement issued during a televised speech, Iran's president Masoud Pezeshkian seemed to signal that the crisis may already be out of control, and we'll quote him here, "We should not expect the government to handle all of this alone. The government simply does not have that capacity," end quote. And before we continue, we'd like to take a brief moment to introduce ourselves to the many people who are probably seeing our coverage for the very first time. It's been a wild 2026 so far, and that means more people watch our videos. Hello there. We here at Warfronts are a relatively new addition to the world of conflict analysis, but we believe that we are offering something here on YouTube that can cut through the noise that we've all become used to across global media. At Warfronts, our team makes it our mission to deliver clear, focused explanations of conflicts and geopolitical shifts across the globe, with all the context and all the nuance that you should be able to have at your disposal. We don't claim to be experts. We don't claim to be unbiased. Instead, we try to be a conduit for all the very best expert analysis that we can find and present it in a way that actually makes sense and actually matters, while staying aware of our own biases, which everyone has, so that they don't compromise our content as best we can. Bias is everywhere. If that sounds like something you'd like to have as part of your media diet, please do consider subscribing, and if you'd like to support the work that we do here, then do check out our premium website, fronts.co. There we dive even deeper on underreported conflicts and invite experts and award-winning journalists to share what they really believe that you need to know. It all costs just $5 a month or $50 a year. I think that's a pretty great deal, and it also helps our team expand our free offerings while staying financially independent. Which is important because, again, bias. And if you'd like one more reason to check it out, we'll be publishing a free Ask Us Anything episode on fronts.co this Friday. You don't have to be a member, just go over to the website and you will find it there. And it's going to be all about the fallout from Venezuela, plus articles breaking this whole situation down even further. Check it out, and for our viewers who already subscribe, well, thank you for your support.
Imagine being able to build an app with your name on it, just by thinking about it. Meet Base 44, a complete AI creation platform.
Turning up the heat. Now, even with all the unrest and upheaval that Iran is facing, we've got to emphasize that regime collapse is not a foregone conclusion. If nothing else, Iran's leaders have shown themselves to be very resilient in the face of acute crises, and although the problems now are more acute than the Mahsa Amini protests ever were, there's still a non-zero chance that Tehran can bring this situation back under control. But this time, there's another problem to consider, that Iran's global adversaries have been waiting for a moment like this, and now they're turning up the heat. Right now, it's Israel leading the charge, where Benjamin Netanyahu and his government have been signaling for months that a renewed conflict with Iran could be imminent. Recently, Netanyahu traveled to the United States to brief the Trump administration on plans for another round of major strikes, with Trump signaling that he, and thus Israel's most important international backer, was in favor of the idea. According to Israel, Iran has been working to rebuild and reconstitute groups like Hezbollah abroad, repairing its missile production cycle, and potentially even working to resume its nuclear program. Israel has taken an acute interest in Iran's growing protests, with high-level Israeli officials signaling that their nation will support the protest movement, and recently Israel has placed pressure on Iranian allies abroad. Starting this Monday, Israel renewed its campaign of airstrikes against Hezbollah and Hamas targets across Lebanon after Lebanese officials missed an Israel-imposed deadline to disarm Hezbollah on their own. Open-source intelligence reports, citing Israeli sources, indicate that Netanyahu may have approved a military attack plan that could go into effect as soon as the next 48 hours, and Israel's military appears to have moved into a new state of high alert. The latest news out of the United States may be even worse for Iran, especially in the wake of the United States' brazen regime change operation in Venezuela just days ago. After the capture of Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro, Trump and his inner circle publicly warned world nations that they'd be wise to pay attention, and according to Iranian officials speaking to Reuters, there's a real fear in Tehran that they'll become, quote, the next victim of Trump's aggressive foreign policy, end quote. Last week, on the day before the Venezuela operation, Trump took to social media to threaten that if the Iranian regime killed, quote, peaceful protesters, then the United States was, quote, locked and loaded and ready to go. That statement was issued when the reported death toll in Iran was still in the single digits. As of the time of writing, the count of the dead stands at 35, including minors. Publicly, Iran has responded with all of its usual fire and brimstone. In remarks on Tuesday, Supreme Leader Khamenei said that his nation does not believe that Israel will avoid seeking confrontation, and that in response, Iran will not limit its response to a future act of Israeli aggression. In fact, he threatens that Iran could even launch a first strike if it believed that its interests or its sovereignty had come under sufficient threat. On Monday, Iranian state media reported that the nation had received a transfer of Iskander missiles from Russia. The Iskander is a ballistic missile with up to a 700-kilogram warhead and up to a 500-kilometer range, not enough to reach Israel, but more than enough to strike US assets in Qatar, Bahrain, or Kuwait, force the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, or attack critical oil infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, or other Gulf nations. Privately, though, it appears that Khamenei may have different plans. A recent report in The Times, citing Western intelligence, suggests that he's concocted a plan to flee to Russia if protests begin to really overwhelm Iranian security forces. According to that report, Khamenei and up to 23 aides and family members will fly straight to Moscow on a plane filled with cash and other assets, in a plan informed by Bashar al-Assad's actions during the collapse of the Syrian regime in 2024. And at this point, I can imagine them playing video games together in Russia. And yes, that means that there is a real chance that the geopolitical upheaval of the early 2020s ends with Khamenei and Assad together on the couch in an apartment. I think Evan wrote this and he's making the same joke that I made. And they're going to play Call of Duty, really amazing. Regardless of Khamenei's true intentions, all signs point to imminent military action in the Middle East, and probably with Iran in the crosshairs. Over the last several days, over a dozen American strategic airlifters have crossed the Atlantic, first to Britain, and then further eastward. According to reports from the UK Defence Journal, many of those airlifters are carrying helicopters operated by the Night Stalkers, the elite special operations unit that flew Delta Force commandos into the heart of Caracas just days ago. Speaking of Delta Force, they've reportedly pivoted to the Middle East as well, with other elite American units in Europe, including Army Rangers and Air Assault Forces, being repositioned rapidly as we speak. Flight tracking data has showed US and British refueling tankers and airlifters all headed into the Middle East, while open source analysis has suggested that an unexplained backout across Greek and Cypriot airspace on Monday may have been intended to mask the movement of US assets. American intelligence aircraft have been operating continuously off the Iranian coast, and the commander of US CENTCOM has just made the long journey to Bahrain. According to the outlet Kurdistan 24, Delta Force operators are currently taking positions along Iraq's borders with Syria and Jordan, possibly with a short-term objective of dealing with the Iran-backed militias in the area that are refusing calls to disarm, although those reports are currently a bit hazy. Finally, we'd be remiss not to mention a series of reports suggesting trouble in Syria, where Israel has reportedly warned the nation's transitional leader, Ahmed al-Sharaa, that Iran is planning to kill him. Recent rumors suggest that al-Sharaa himself was lightly wounded in a recent clash at the presidential palace in Damascus, while Israeli military sources have shared anonymously that they're preparing for Iran to launch an attack somewhere across the Middle East, all seeming to indicate that a sudden crisis, either involving al-Sharaa or otherwise, could prompt an immediate military response from Jerusalem. Worst of all for the Iranian regime, the Ayatollahs have no reason to believe that they could deter action from either Israel or the United States right now. Iskander missiles aside, Iran's air defenses were thoroughly devastated in its 12-day war with Israel and the exchanges that preceded it, and the country has basically no means to protect itself from an imminent aerial attack. Its stockpiles of long-range missiles and drones haven't been fully destroyed, but they've been seriously diminished, along with much of their launch infrastructure, while Israel's decision to destroy key facilities in Iran's missile production supply chain means that it can't replenish its stockpiles anytime soon. Its international proxy forces are in no position to help, its ground forces are useless against an Israeli military with no desire to face it on land, and while Tehran could threaten the Strait of Hormuz or the Middle East's oil production, it has nowhere near the firepower it would need to deal with the overwhelming retaliation that would follow. And all of that would already be bad enough, even if Iranian society wasn't in a state of total upheaval. Right now, the walls are closing in on the Ayatollahs from all sides, not passively, not by accident, but because the many forces that would like to see Iran's regime fall have all recognized that this is their moment. The nation's protest movement is taking control, Israel is poised and ready to engage in an all-out conflict, and the United States has made it abundantly clear that it will not be held back by any international limit besides its own ambition. Iran is on the brink of collapse, and its leaders, its citizens, and its enemies all seem to know it. The thing that comes next is destruction, and Iran may not have much time before that process begins. Thank you for watching.